Thank you. Awesome. Looks like we have a small group today of familiar faces. So I'm going to skip over introductions and we can move right into release planning and updates. Maybe starting with the implementation. Natalie, do you have release planning or updates?
We might be shipping a lifecycle patch to unblock pack. It's very nuanced, but it's a small change. Look out for that. No other updates besides that.
Sounds good. Do we have anyone from platform here?
There was a new pack release. Think it was mainly around some stuff to unlock the Heroku folks on using some credential helpers in pack as a library, not as a binary. I think that was 025. So not a lot in terms of flip CNB either.
All right, thanks for the updates, everybody. Moving on to our first planned topic for today. I think this was one that you suggested, Sam, sort of continuing our discussion around in container phases that are not part of the life cycle because they don't interact with build packs platform helpers, basically.
There's no one from the platform team, so I wanted one of the maintainers to be here. So I don't know if
worth talking about today. Maybe we need to corner Javier separately.
Yeah, and David, if he, I think he also had some opinions. But I think we discussed a bit of this in the core team sync yesterday, where we were fine with making, like, I think Javier was supposed to make some changes to the governance document in a community repository along the lines of maintainers can delegate responsibilities to contributors on a per repository basis, but each of these helpers or any other repository in the Buildpacks project must be within the domain of some team. And it's up to that team's maintainers to just figure out how to set up the repository GitHub permissions so that the contributors can contribute effectively.
Just to give some background to folks who weren't part of this conversation on the motivation, so we can do more rapid prototyping around some of these things. If there's a contributor that's interested in kicking off a stream of work in a separate repository that we're not pulling all the way into the critical workflow yet, we want to be able to allow a broader set of people to review and merge.
Yeah, these components would still require an RFC for a new repository to be created, but once a repository exists, whichever team maintains that repository, the maintainers of that team can then delegate GitHub permissions accordingly on a per repository basis rather than on a team-wide basis. So right now, what we have is we have two types of roles in the project. We have contributors which have write access to all the repositories that a team owns, but they can't merge things. They can approve things and they can create branches, but they can't merge things to main or release branches. And we have maintainers who have effectively admin access to all the GitHub repositories within that team's purview. This would allow contributors to have different levels of permissions, which will be documented somehow, either through code owners or some other means, which Javier is yet to propose. And the maintainers of that team are responsible for keeping this information public and up to date.
I think one restriction we wanted to put on it was definitely to make sure we're using teams or sub-teams in the GitHub sense in order to express these new roles. So I don't think we want the Wild West where we're, giving individuals permissions in code owners files. We want all of this to be expressed through, RBAC rather than individual access. Does anyone have thoughts or concerns on that topic? It will obviously need broader approval from the core team to change the governance, but hopefully it shouldn't be too controversial.
I think the other sort of use case for this was like project level donations or repository level donations into the project itself. So if someone wants to donate a repository to the project, but they have maintained it for a while, through this model, they can still retain right or administrative access within that repository, but they don't necessarily need to be maintainers of that team or have to deal with any of the other repositories that that team owns. They can be contributors to that team with elevated permissions on the repository that they contributed. But yeah. Oh, Javier is here.
Given that we have Javier now, do you want to kick off a discussion of some of the contents of the platform phases?
Yeah. So you were just, Javier, for background, you were working through like the proposal we discussed yesterday with the rest of the working group. And you were just waiting for one of the platform maintainers to chip in.
Cool. I know we talked about this briefly yesterday. I know we left with some sort of action items. What is more or less the current status or really the question at hand right now?
I think we put this there yesterday in the agenda before we'd gone through the discussion around the GitHub level permissions and stuff. But I think apart from that, the current RFCs are still blocked. And I think they're sub-team RFCs. So I'm waiting for one of the platform maintainers to approve. Do we want to wait for the governance changes to happen for the RFC to be approved, or are we comfortable approving it?
I know the sort of permissions part of it is really sort of something that, if I'm not mistaken, Emily, you made mention that it may be good to get some sort of buy-in from everybody. And I think so because of that, I think we'd probably want to make sure that that gets accepted before we finalize and approve the RFCs. So sort of a chain of events, right, would be kind of that. But that being said, right, the practicality of the contents of what we're trying to achieve, I think those could get started. It's just where they live and how do they get organized after the fact.
Yeah. Would it make sense to, for now, just merge the RFC? The RFC doesn't actually have any like specific contents in terms of who contributes that specific feature or like what permissions they have. I think that's independent. We can just start with the current model where you can start off with a pull request. Some of the maintainers if they want, I can just block the review until some maintainer reviews it. But I guess we can at least create the repository, right? There's no blocker on creating the repository. It's just the blocker was who approves and merges things.
Right, and who owns the repositories. But I think at this point, the platform team would be comfortable, I mean, speaking for everybody there, would be comfortable taking on those repositories, at least in the interim.
So yeah, I guess the only thing there is like for platform maintainers to approve that RFC, I'm assuming when they approve, they're approving the fact that they're okay taking ownership of these components in whatever way you decide.
Yeah, okay. Yes, so I'll take a sort of action item to basically review, and I'll undraft my PR as well and sort of try to get some eyes on that and finalize that.
Yeah, I think the same was for your RFCs one. I don't know which of the two we are moving forward with. There's one for OCI exporter and one for the remove daemon support. I don't know which of those two is the newer one or the one for the publisher.
Yeah, seem a little surprised there, Juan. So we have been talking about the publisher kind of in the same
Oh,
context.
okay.
You know, where the publisher is another sort of utility for platforms, right? Or platform tooling is what we're kind of calling it. And publisher is one of the things that sort of came to our mind as well when we're having conversations about the preparer and the co-signer or signer functionality.
Wouldn't the publisher be similar to, right? How does this interact with the exporter, I guess?
I think part of the RFC was the idea of, and this was all kind of in that track of work of trying to remove the Docker daemon support, right? And so it was where the exporter would essentially export to only two mechanisms, which would be the registry and OCI layout. And then you would have another mechanism called a publisher that would more or less be things that Pack would do and other platforms would do as well, which could then put them into Docker daemon and or any other sort of areas or locations that we might deem necessary in the future.
I thought it was
a whole bunch of other, thoughts that have come up.
I thought it was the opposite. It was supposed to be lifecycle puts it in the daemon and the publisher takes a look at the image and some other metadata to publish it to the registry. So there was like pack build and then pack publish instead of Docker build and Docker publish. I thought its responsibility was to take things from the daemon and put it on the registry.
Maybe I'll let Juan speak to that,
Okay.
but I think it was part of removing the daemon support. But yes,
Yes,
there's
I'm trying to check the RFCs, but I can't remember the const of those. But yes, I remember what Sam is mentioning, that one idea was to keep the daemon, right? And somehow save the metadata in some other place where Pack then can, if you make the Pack published and you add some annotations and stuff, but you save that image into the daemon, then Pack can figure it out and push all those information without having the user to do something again to do it, right? So, but I can't remember what we talk about that and what was left. And but yeah, I know all this stuff are related. We have the RFC to export to OCI format. That's one that it's there. It's still on draft, but I can remember also is what things were pending. Based on that one, exporting to OCI, we have that option that Javier is mentioning that will help to remove the daemon because Lifecycle will only export to OCI layout, and then Pack or any other platform can do something with it and deal with the daemon if it's that what we want. And then we have the other option that Sam is mentioning. We keep the daemon, we save the metadata somehow, some other way, and then we offer the features to platform to put things together and push to a registry if the user save it. I'm not sure which one are we going to do, if we can do both, or which were the cons or the things open. I will take a look on the RFC and comments and see.
Yeah, maybe it's worth, because again, it seems like we've experimented quite a bit, and we've at the same time the whole build kit conversation came about, right? And that seemed like maybe that was something that could help us out in this sort of decision-making process. But I do recall that at some point, if I'm not mistaken, from the implementation team, the lifecycle wanted to remove the Docker daemon, right? Like that was a goal or hope. I think a lot of this comes with Juan, right? And the platform team trying to figure out whether or not we could alleviate some of that or help in that regard by shifting that responsibility over to the platform side of things. So ultimately, I think it really depends on the answer of, or the request of the implementation team, right? So if the implementation team, I don't know if they've changed their mind on whether they want to keep the Docker daemon support or not, but if we build this, right, and then there's still Docker daemon support in the lifecycle, then that just kind of creates some sort of misalignment there. So maybe it's really up to the implementation team to give us a little guidance.
Seems like because this is touching many parts of the system, it makes sense as a top level RFC, right? Like this isn't a sub-team level decision.
Would we consider it a platform or an implementation RFC, right? Because no matter what, we still have sort of that designation.
You're talking
I
sort of
would
like
say
in the roles,
Like ownership, right? Like who's
Mhm.
shepherding this through. I kind of feel like it should be implementation, right? Because again, it's sort of based on their input or primary core input as to whether or not they want to exile the Docker daemon support.
That makes sense to me. I think at the end of the day, because we're going to, I think it could go either way, right? Like I'm okay with either sub-team, whichever one like has the bandwidth and the passion to take the RFC to the point where it's ready for everyone to look at. I think it's fine. Like we don't have to. Like I don't think finding the exact right team is a important part of this as long as it has a team owner. But it's going to touch both either way, right?
Yeah, and to some degree, I want to understand what the goal is, right? It seems like there's various goals. One of the goals is to align the daemon functionality or set of features with registry, right? We talk about annotations, we talk about some attributions and so forth that are at, I believe, a manifest level. And that's something missing, obviously, from the Docker daemon. Then there's another goal, which is basically removing the complexity that's built into the lifecycle for the daemon support. Are those the two goals? Are they kind of tied at the hip, or should we try to tackle them independently?
Those are the two goals.
Okay, so those are the two goals of the RFC that we're trying to satisfy. So the implementation team does want to remove the complexity of the Docker daemon support. That I feel like that one's not like a straight answer, right? I feel like there's a little bit of waffling, right, as to whether or not we want to do that.
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of all the other implementation maintainers. I personally feel like getting rid of the daemon complexity would be good. good for the project. Making things simpler in the spec, having fewer if cases and special features, I think brings the functionality of the life cycle in the direction we want to go, which is more straightforward.
Agree. And the only reason I think that there has been some waffling is because we seem to have we've had so many conversations, but when we talk ourselves into a corner where we get to a place where we say, we can't solve our problem and get everything we want without having the life cycle take on some more complexity. And then we kind of throw up our hands and say, okay, let's just do it in the life cycle. But I sort of wonder if we really thought it through, all the way, because it seems like there has to be an elegant solution here. If not elegant, not increasing our pain, right?
So it sounds like the way I would phrase this is the primary goal is to align feature sets between Docker daemon and registry. The secondary goal, be it secondary, would be the removal or externalizing of the daemon from the lifecycle. But it seems like that's not so much of a strict requirement, is kind of what I'm hearing, depending on sort of what the downsides or cost would be. Are there any specific features that the lifecycle needs from the daemon, either currently or going forward? Because I know that we were talking about the Docker file stuff at some point, whether that would use Conoco or execute them against the daemon itself. I don't know, again, too much of the details there, but is that something we foresee being a requirement?
I hope not. I was gonna say, I hope not, because if you have a Docker daemon, you can just, we can provide some logic to facilitate the platform just invoking the Docker daemon with the Docker files that it wants to use. The Conoco is not involved, even like the life cycle shouldn't be involved at that point, right? It's just here platform, here are some Docker files, run them, right? So I would hope that is kind of orthogonal to this discussion.
I feel like we can't have a hard dependency on the Docker daemon, like the lifecycle cannot. Pack can have a hard dependency on the Docker daemon because that's the tool it chooses to orchestrate its containers, right? That's where it runs the lifecycle phases. But there are other platforms that run Kubernetes or don't have a dependency on the daemon. So I feel like the lifecycle, because the lifecycle can't depend on the daemon, I feel like the lifecycle shouldn't do any daemon things at all because it's always going to be an option rather than a necessity. And I feel like fewer options is better, especially because the daemon API, I feel like is not as much of I feel like the OCI spec in terms of like how you put images on disk or in the registry is the standard we should be building towards.
Okay, that makes sense. That's the one thing that came to my mind, but I think thinking through it wouldn't make sense, would be the creator workflow.
What about it?
The creator workflow with files, that still seems like, not knowing a lot of the intimate details between the Docker file implementation or in the Docker file implementation, how would that work?
It has to use Conoco. Like we
mm.
can't depend on the daemon here, I don't think. Like if the creator ended up depending on the daemon, I would be the first to say that we should be dumping the creator then, because it's not like fulfilling its role of being a life cycle that can run in every platform. It's platform specific at that point.
Cool. All right, then yeah, that makes me feel more comfortable then. So the only downsides, and again, we'll kind of play with this through the RFC process, but would be probably any performance implications or inconveniences, right? So performance implications of exporting to something like OCI layout, and then having to take that and load it into the daemon, or having to spin up a ephemeral registry proxy or something like that. That could be another sort of challenge. I know there's been discussion of things like the Spring Boot plugin, right? And sort of the inconvenience there if we were to remove the daemon support from the lifecycle. That one seems a little bit more challenging, but I don't know that we should sort of take responsibility for the Spring Boot implementation. But again, I know that there's sort of like that's something that we got to take into consideration.
Yeah,
But
yeah, you just nailed it. Yes, that was the thing. Yeah.
I feel like as we design this solution for PAC, we should reach out to the maintainers of that plugin to make sure whatever we're working on works for that platform as well. Maybe Ozzy has some insight on this. At one point, Ozzy, weren't you maintaining a Java-based platform that was basically like PAC and similar to the Spring Boot plugin?
It's very similar. Yes, it's a Java implementation, and it's still in use by a few different places. And yeah, when the Dockerfile stuff comes along, I'm looking forward to what I'm going to have to do to tweak it to make it work. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be any difficulty there, because whatever happens at the end of the day with that, it's still just basically launching containers and telling them to run. So at the moment, it's using the creator lifecycle mainly because that's quicker. Because that way I don't have the overhead of having to daisy chain like 7 different container launches together, one after the other. And that's my fear when we start talking about things with the Docker files, like we can make it the responsibility of the platform to apply the Docker files sequentially. Sure, absolutely. If you want to make this thing perform like an absolute so-and-so, then we can go that way. But it's costly to have to spin up these containers. And what you're saying here is I'll need to spin up all of the phases to the point where the Docker files are generated. And now I'll need to basically run Docker stuff to apply each generated Docker file, of which there could be N, which is a bad thing at this point. And then after those are done, now I can get back to actually doing the build. But again, I'm still not on the creator path at this point. So by the time we're done, we could have spun up and launched like a couple of 100 containers if you're unlucky with the number of Docker files that got generated. I mean, I'm counting the application of a Docker file as sort of the spinning up of a container. It's not really, but it's in the same vein, right? Because you're going to have to run all the different instructions within it. And if you're driving that via Docker, it's still not going to be quick. So that's my thought there. Whereas the Canico stuff we've got at the moment, at least internalizes all of that and hides it from the platform so that I just give it a poke and it comes out and it's done the business and I'm happy and I step away at the end. And that makes me as a platform, person a lot happier with my implementation. It also, I hope, would mean that there'll be less variation between implementations between platforms, because once you start allowing platforms to make decisions as to how they're going to do this stuff, then that's where you'll start getting behavioral differences start to creep in within the stuff later on. Anyway, that's my thoughts.
And to get your take on the other part of the conversation or change that we're thinking about is, what implications would you run into if the lifecycle were to remove daemon support, right? And the only ways that you could export for your processor plugin would be OCI layout or OCI registry.
I can't really speak to that much because the usage info that I've got back at the moment doesn't really speak either way as to which one people are using. I mean, it's daemon is the default just because it's quick and it gets the job done. But I think at the end of the day, providing it works, if it was something that was affecting all of build packs moving forwards, it's not something I would fight against. You know what I mean? Because it's like this is a direction then that build packs takes, and everybody that uses build packs either agrees with this and moves forwards, or build packs dies because they decide they didn't like it and they find something else to use.
So I think I know Sam gave us a time check, but I just want to make clear, Ozzy, that what this ultimately would mean would be that newer builders with newer life cycles wouldn't have, well, I guess newer platform APIs as well, wouldn't have daemon support. So you would output to, let's say, OCI layout, and then you would have a secondary process to essentially feed that into the daemon if you wanted your, plugin or your tool to basically have daemon support, right? And that's something that we want to provide tooling for, but it would be like a Go sort of executable. But again, that's sort of the idea right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's doable. You could almost see that as an extra. I mean, if it was an extra lifecycle binary that's tagged on the end that was sort of like that took the argument of the daemon, and then it could take the image and put it in. So it's still a provided thing, and it wouldn't be something that as a platform creator I would have to write much to do. It'd just be another documented invocation of a given executable with arguments that I can derive from the existing platform invocation.
Cool.
Is an extra executable to run actually that much easier than just calling Docker load on an OCI image on disk? Because like the platforms are already interacting with the daemon, API.
So yes, actually, it would be to a certain extent, because I wouldn't be able to guarantee that I would have Docker CLI available to me from within my platform, whereas I may have access to a Docker daemon that I can poke things at.
I mean, like using I guess a lot of that logic is in the client side on Docker. It's like whatever library you're using to interface with Docker in Java already, I wonder if it just has a, load.
I mean, if that's the case,
implementation.
and go that way. Yeah. Whichever's easiest at that point, isn't it? But it's, I mean, I wouldn't want to call down to the CLI and invoke the equivalent of.
No, not suggesting
because,
that. Like,
okay, that's what I first heard.
The
I'm like,
library.
No. Yeah, exactly. But if you're talking an API approach to actually drive it, then I don't see why that would be a difference either. The only reason I would say that it would be worth keeping it in the lifecycle is if there's any extra steps or value that needs to be done that could be done there, then you've got an access point to add that, and you've still got a control point. Say like you want to make sure that you apply certain labels or certain tags to the image once they've been pushed, then that's the sort of thing that it's handy to do in one place then.
Mm-hmm. I feel like if that binary, when someone goes to write it, ends up just being like Docker client.load with a path, that probably exists in the Java client API too. And then maybe
because I mean, then you've basically written a single use version of the Docker CLI that doesn't have the argument Docker load and just does it with a.
Yeah, I think that's where the publisher was supposed to do the things the other way around. It was lifecycle would still just publish to the daemon, and if you wanted to publish back to the registry with all the required information, you had that publisher. Then it's a complex thing than just Docker load.
Are you suggesting getting rid of the not supporting registry or OCI on disk? I feel like that wouldn't work in like a KPAC case at all, right?
No. I'm saying that the lifecycle exists as it does today. It's just so that features like annotations or signatures are not blocked when you use the daemon. That's the part that the publisher covers. So if you export an image with annotations, that information is currently lost when you export to the daemon. If you still want that information when you publish to the registry, you just use the publisher binary. So instead of doing Docker publish, you'll do pack publish.
Rather than like going to the lossy format, which is the daemon, and then having something extra that like translates when you want to go to the registry, I'd rather go to the format where we lose no information and then leave it up to the platform to put it into the lossy format. But we should probably move on to our other topic with our remaining 20 minutes. project scaffolding in Pack.
I suppose I should just summarize where we are. Wrote the RFC. I haven't updated the RFC obviously in a few weeks, but we presented some options from the RFC to folk, and there was one particular route that people wanted to go down, which was to better look at having some kind of third-party scaffolding tool that we could plug into to Pack in order to generate these things. So I've been playing around with that. I've been developing a third-party tool, which is designed to plug into Pack. So, I mean, right now, where it is right now is Sambhav was kind enough to do a design and code review earlier on this week. I now have a list of 11 different things to fix. He was being kind on me. And once I've got those 11 things done, I'll consider at least the interface good enough to be able to revisit the document, effectively describe the interface in the document. And we're still in a position where if this is not the route that we want to go down, then there are the other options in the document are reasonable things to choose. So I suppose that's where we are with this at the moment. I've got a few hours tomorrow to hopefully address some of those 11 things and update the document. But yeah, there is some progress being made on it. And please shout at me and tell me if there's anything you want to see in particular. I should say, as I've gone along, I've been trying to make sure that I keep the documentation reasonably clean, because there's absolutely no point in us having an onboarding tool that doesn't have good documentation. So hopefully it is, yeah, as I said, there's some things to clean up in the code, and it will all change, but hopefully the documentation is good enough to explain what we're trying to achieve here.
Is this a trustworthy third party for us to take a dependency on?
I mean, I think that's a reasonable question, more than reasonable question to ask. I mean, we don't want to take on the dependency ourselves. Then the question is, who do we trust? I know there are a bunch of organizations that might be interested in taking something like this. But again, how wide would the maintainership be is always a question to ask. So, you know, given Sambhav's direction on this, I think I can produce something that's more widely used, and hopefully we can then get some more maintainers involved in maintaining it going forward.
I am curious, just for sort of make sure I paint the right picture. So this is sort of like a standalone utility like CLI and library, and how we envision Pack to leverage this would be through a sort of like library functionality where it would just inherit the functionality that it provides, but within Pack itself. Is that right?
Yes. So the Pack CLI would invoke the library in some way to create new projects. So the way you're currently doing Pack build Pack new, instead of invoking the code that's currently within Pack, it might call out to such a library and get it to just generate the project for us. So yeah, if you look at the documentation, there's some talk about overrides in it, and these are things that would be passed from Pack into this library. So if you want a specific API version in the something, or if you want a specific string somewhere, then it's designed so that you can pass things in. This is one of the things, that interface is something that is going to change over the next few days, because there are nicer ways of doing it. But that's the general idea, yes.
Cool, awesome. I love it so far. So it looks good. Good work.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, unless there are other comments, I mean, I don't, we can return to the previous arguments.
I guess if we have some extra time, maybe I'll throw another topic out at us, which is, I think, like a meta topic about this meeting. I feel like one of our goals recently has been to enable the teams more to make progress without running everything through the top level of the project. And that's exciting. And I want to support that. But I wonder if more action is happening sort of in teams and at team syncs, whether we want to move. I'm curious about maybe like setting up a rotation where teams then present what's going on in the team to the larger group, more of like an update information blast part of this meeting, in addition to some of our more open-ended discussions. What people think about that?
Could you give us an example of what that may look like that's different than just, very similar to the release updates that we do on other meetings?
I'm thinking more around sub-team RFCs and stuff like that. Just sort of like giving a highlight, like here's the problems that this team has been wrangling with, and we're thinking about moving these RFCs to a vote soon. Here are the priorities for the sub-team. Like, it doesn't have to be every week, like every team. It's more like, would each team want to go once a month and be like, just for those who aren't deeply involved in platform, here's like what's going on here.
Maybe I'll speak for myself somewhat selfishly. But I think that if I care about what's going on in a particular sub team, I would go to their sub team, sync. I guess for me, and maybe I'm just asking like for everybody's time to be sort of respected. Like I find more value in these meetings being more like high level or very cross-cutting, as opposed to being team specific.
If Javier, if I could just pose maybe like a quick addendum to that, is I think I agree. I would like to just go to the team's meeting when there's something that I care about, but I don't always know if that team is talking about something if I'm caring about, if I'm not necessarily up to date on their particular agenda. So I guess maybe as someone who's a bit more on the fringe of being completely embedded in the CNB community, having a way to have that agenda bubble to me in some way, even if it's not this meeting, would be something that would be appreciated.
I think we've tried doing this for some of the BAT topics. We often discuss it first in the sub-team meetings, and then if we think that this impacts the community at large, or if you want to get a wider opinion, we try to bring it up here in the working group again. Like, to give you some examples, we've talked about structured logging first in the BAT sync, and then in the working group, the recent builder config stuff first in the BAT sync, and then the working group. So I think we do a lot of ideation and discussion in the sub-team sync, and we present like a summary of those discussions in the working group to get people to join back in or provide feedback. But I don't know if every team would have things like that. Like, I don't know what like distribution team, for example. I don't even know what kind of updates they would have if like they're changing some internal implementation of like how the registry API is working or something, or like updating on the GitHub actions. Same for lifecycle, if there's like some internal reorg of or refactoring of code. And that's all they've been working at for the past 1 month or so in the sub-team sync. not sure how much utility that provides sharing that in the wider audience. I think it should be up to the respective maintainers to figure out topics that would be applicable to the wider audience and bring it up.
Yeah, I think definitely for conversation pieces, right? I think that seems like the right approach. I do want to maybe ask, Forrest, to your point, like if there's a better way of bubbling those things up or providing that sort of visibility, I guess is the right term, without having to be somewhat what sounds to be almost like forceful of like, hey, you're gonna present this month, right? Like your team's gonna present this month. Like come with something to say, because again, a lot of things and a lot of conversations happen right within that month. Like maybe Forrest cared about something that happened on the first week, but it was so fast that it's no longer relevant by the time your month comes up. If that's sort of the main ask, then maybe we should solve for that.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is I don't know that I necessarily have an additional solution, but I would just say that if there is a current structure for defining what the agenda of a sub team is, I don't currently know where to find it. Like I can obviously see previous weeks discussion topics in like the sub team document that there is, but I don't necessarily know if there's a great way of me seeing that like in an asynchronous fashion like you're talking about. And if there is, I'm just ignorant to it. And so maybe having some device like putting a link on your community page to where that would be sufficient. So I guess that's what I would say. Having a direct link to the agendas of various sub teams in some place that can be like, if I drop in on Slack and say, hey, I'm looking at this, then you could say, oh, great. Well, the sub team is thinking about talking about that here. Here's a link to that agenda. That could be something nice.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing as well is something that I think we've been pretty poor of doing in other sub-team meetings, but I think we do fairly well in working group is setting the agenda beforehand, right? I think that's something that would bring a lot of value. It is hard to do, right? Like we even find it hard to do on the working group sometimes, but it seems like that would bring about a lot more value. So that way you can choose ahead of time whether or not you want to be present.
I think that's the biggest piece of feedback that I get from my team currently is that they already have a lot of commitments to meetings and they don't necessarily want to make another one if it's not going to be relevant to them. So being able to find the relevance would be perfect.
Yeah, I would be in favor, at least for some of the meetings that I either facilitate or partake in, to say that if we don't have an agenda item, we should just cancel that meeting ahead of time. I know some other communities sort of take that pretty strong stance as well. And I find that to be somewhat successful in their communities. So that's something I would be in favor of.
Well, maybe that's something that we can, maybe the first version of this is just a request to all the sub teams to think about how we're bubbling up information and be organically conscious of that, and setting agendas, and then see how that goes.
Yeah, I think being a little bit more loud about upcoming meetings and being a little bit more forceful of requesting agenda items before the meetings is something that at least I would take as an action item and try for at least the platform sync. I think learning is something I no longer am responsible for, or I don't know.
Same, I can say the same for that. I think one thing I've seen in some of the other working groups is that they ask a couple of days before the meeting, like they do a Slack sort of announcement that, hey, please put agenda items, and then on the day of the meeting, they either do like a tweet, right, a couple of hours before the meeting, here are the agenda items we'll be talking about, here are the time slots. And same thing on Slack. So people who follow them on Slack or some other social media are aware that, okay, this is what they're talking about in the meeting today.
Yeah, and then I want to also maybe talk about something we've recently been pushing a little bit more is for like autonomy of independent teams, right? So I think it's good to maybe have the soon to be leads maybe take ownership of that. Sort of the ask being, hey, how do we bubble stuff up? And then the leads could try whatever feels more appropriate for their teams.
On that note, should we wrap it up for today? Have a good one, everybody.